we can go ahead and get started. I see we have 16 attendees. It's good that all of you are here. Maybe more will trickle in as we move along. Again, I'm Sanjay Lal. I'm glad to chair today's session on Gandhi's influence on the civil rights movement. Once again, the format, from my understanding, will be each panelist will have roughly 15 minutes. I will do my best to keep time, and then we'll have time for discussion. I trust everyone to appropriately mute themselves when it's time, and my preference is for people to ask questions there in the chat as we move along, although I will try and check my email and also the Q&A box periodically as we move along too. I think the order is it Gail, then Anthony, then Greg, is that correct? Or um, okay, if that works for everyone, we'll stick with that. Uh, Dr. Gil Presby, she's coming to us from the Detroit area. She is at the University of Mercy, where she's been for some time. Dr. Presby is a very well accomplished scholar, not just on Gandhian philosophy, but in peace philosophy, and also in various subfields of, you could say, non-traditional, non-Western thought. I've known Gail now for a number of years and always appreciate her insights. I will first turn the floor over to you, Gail, and then Anthony and Greg. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Gail.
Okay, just a note that the printed program does say Greg goes second. Just in case people are trying to go back and forth, we could stick to the printed program.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, if that's okay with Anthony, all right. Sorry. So Greg will go second then. Thank you.
Instead of my own unwieldy title, it might be best to call the reflections I'm going to share with you now by the title of the panel instead. That is, Reflections on Gandhi's Influence on the Civil Rights Movement. My role on this panel is to give a general overview, and then Greg and Anthony will focus in on the work of two specific individuals, Howard Thurman and William Stewart Nelson. I'm also engaged here in a genealogy of Gandhi's ideas. I'll start with Gandhi's South African years, from the 1890s to 1914, with the influence of Gandhi, and then go to the influence of Gandhi on W.B. Du Bois, and then look at a couple of books that recently cover Gandhi's influence on Pauli Murray, Howard Thurman, and Bayard Rustin, among others. I'm drawing on snippets from two quite long articles of mine currently under review, as well as a just published book review in the Acorn. But I want to start out with a caution regarding our focus on Gandhi. It is too easy for us to focus on the greatness of an individual. I don't want to doubt Gandhi's greatness. It's just that when we focus on that, what we neglect is the great contributions of the collaborators, many of them women, who are not as famous as the central person, but without their many efforts, Gandhi, in this case, would not have achieved the goals of his many nonviolent actions. And to focus on how Gandhi was an inspiration for African Americans neglects how they were an inspiration for him. I'll try to mention some of that in my paper. A recent book by Danielle McGuire, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement, explains how, while history is often focused on Martin Luther King Jr., as the movement leader who made things happen during the civil rights movement. In fact, there were many women, Rosa Parks and others, who prepared the ground for him by years of activism and community building. In the same spirit, and despite my disagreement with several interpretations of Gandhi's actions and motives in their book, I do appreciate Desai and Vahed's Gandhi, Stretcher Bearer of Empire, for helping us to know of the many Indians, both men and women, including many brave indentured laborers, who helped to make Gandhi's earlier 1909 resistance and then the 1913 Satyagraha, both in South Africa, a success. Gandhi considered Black South Africans to be his role model and precursors in acts of non-cooperation with the colonial government in South Africa. In The Duty of Transvaal Indians, which he wrote in 1906, Gandhi claimed that, as he called them, the Hottentots, now more accurately known as Khoikhoi or Khoisan, had ignored pass laws. They didn't bother to take out passes, even though the law applied to them. Africans in Natal owed a house tax according to the law, but Gandhi noted some Zulu tribes don't pay. After noting these historical precedents, he says that the Transvaal Indian community's variation or improvement on this precedent was to decide in advance to pass a resolution about what they would do if faced with penalties for their breach of law. Of the various responses open to them, he counsels they only accept jail, and they forbear in steadfastness and good cheer if they lose their property. While he claims it is his or their, the Transvaal Indians, addition, this part which he added, courting arrest and jail, had already widely been practiced by the nonconformists in England and the British suffragettes, whom Gandhi knew well. So he appropriated these recent experiments in nonviolence and had them embraced by his community of Indians living in South Africa. However, in 1906, he took the example of non-payment of taxes and civil disobedience from the women of England and suggested them as an example to the men of his movement. This, even though one of the well-known suffragettes in Britain was the Punjabi princess Sophia Dhuleep Singh. It was not until Charlotte Macchiacchi gathered and delivered to the government 5,000 signatures on a petition to end past requirements for the African and colored or mixed race women of Bloemfontein in 1912, and not until many of the women in this movement were in jail protesting past laws from late May to September 1913, suffering from hard labor and getting reversals on past laws, that Gandhi finally allowed Indian women in his movement to engage in civil disobedience and court arrest. It was Sol Plaatje, among others, who chronicled the determination of the women of Bloemfontein, Vryhoek, Vinburg, and Jagersfontein to rid themselves of the passes which subjected them to harassment and sexual assault by police. And there were even cases won in South African court at the time regarding sexual assault of women by police. These women set the various cities of Orange Free State scrambling to find enough jail space to house the scores of them who went to jail for the cause. Some neighboring municipalities quickly canceled the enforcement of their past laws so as to avoid the protests and jailings they would have otherwise had to contend with. Gandhi's wife Kasturba and other women living at his ashrams had publicly stated since 1908 that they wanted to be part of the nonviolent protests or satyagrahas organized by Gandhi, and he finally agreed to have them join in 1913, since one of the two issues for which they were protesting, the Marriage Act that invalidated all Indian marriages, and the 3-pound tax directly affected women, he said. Desai and Vahed, Kalpana Hiralal, and others based in the history department of University of KwaZulu-Natal have documented that it was the women who galvanized Gandhi's 1913 nonviolent campaign to its success. It was their speeches, as well as the stories of their suffering in jail, that encouraged indentured servants in the tens of thousands to engage in a sympathetic strike that gave Gandhi the opportunity to negotiate with Smuts for the removal of the Tax and the Marriage Act. Without the African and Indian women's efforts, we may hardly have heard of Gandhi. He would have not returned to India with such a large reputation, which helped him continue his work. Before leaving Gandhi's years in South Africa behind, I think it's important to note another African American whose social movement had influenced Gandhi. While some of Gandhi's written comments and political efforts seem to emphasize the difference between Africans and Indians and suggest that Indians are of higher civilization than Africans, the historian Nico Slate argues that by 1911, Gandhi had changed his thinking and come to believe that Booker T. Washington's moral and practical ideal of self-reliant labor was a better and higher way to live than European and high-caste Indian indolence. In practice, Gandhi had already been engaging in manual and semi-skilled labor through his experiments with ashram living and his work in prison. He intended these activities for himself and his followers. He did not suggest that such labor was the proper role for Blacks. The African and African American practitioners of Washington's philosophy were literally his role models. In a piece from 1907, Indian Opinion says of Zulu leader John Dubé, founder of the Olange Institute, which preceded Gandhi's Phoenix settlement and was the next door neighbor to Gandhi's Phoenix settlement, that his years of strenuous endeavor on behalf of his people had not been spent in vain. It goes on to suggest to Indian readers that they emulate John Dubé. In 1909, Gandhi said that Indians in South Africa should take up industrial education along the lines of Hampton and Tuskegee in the United States. He discouraged Indian youths from aiming to be lawyers and doctors and emphasized instead skilled manual labor as building character and imparting self-esteem that will serve them in the movement for political change. Even as late as 1933, in his publication Harijan, he was still advocating Booker T. Washington, the Hampton Institute, and Tuskegee as role models for Indians. In fact, the ideas of dignity of manual labor became central to Gandhi's approach to uplifting oppressed castes. Slate argues it was Gandhi's interest in Washington over 40 years, nurtured by his correspondence with George Washington Carver, that helped Gandhi develop his own ideas about race and caste. Slate mentions how when African Americans came to visit Gandhi in India, he would always ask them about Washington and wanted to know more about race relations in the US. By the time the US civil rights leaders came to India in the 1930s to seek out Gandhi's advice and help, Gandhi himself had been tutored in nonviolence by Africans in South Africa and by Indians involved in a movement that preceded Gandhi to stop rampant caste discrimination in India. One of the earliest African American leaders to show interest in Gandhi's nonviolent tactics, who clearly raised interest among African Americans of Gandhi's nonviolent movement, was W.B. Du Bois. In his 1957 essay, Gandhi and the American Negroes, Du Bois wrote about his attraction to Gandhi's ideas and example. Quote, "It was not until after the First World War that I came to realize Gandhi's work for Africa and the world. As a youth, I was certain that freedom for the colored peoples of the earth would come only by war, by doing to white Europeans and Americans what they had done to Black and colored Asia." But he goes on to explain that in the late 1890s, he, Du Bois, began to envision world peace. He had signed a pledge not to participate in war. Over time, he got to know of Gandhi, Lajpat Rai, and Madame Sarojini Naidu. A co-worker at the NAACP, John Hayes Holmes, was an admirer of Gandhi. Du Bois had a close friendship with Lala Lajpat Rai, who came to the U.S. in 1917 and founded the Indian Home Rule League of America. Rai returned to India in 1920. However, Rai had not agreed with Gandhi's position on nonviolence. As time went on, it became not the Indian independence movement in general, but the Gandhian nonviolent approach in particular that Du Bois admired and emulated. I'm noticing time is racing despite my
Yeah,
having.
in fact, if no one has a problem, I think uh, we can give each of the panelists 20 minutes instead of 15, like I said. So you still have about a good 7 minutes, Gil.
Okay. Um, all right. Um, I'm going to. There was a high level of racist violence to be found in the U.S. in the years living up to the First World War. In 1909, the year Du Bois began work on forming the NAACP, there had been an anti-Negro riot in the birthplace of Lincoln, Springfield, Illinois. While over 100 people had been indicted for rioting, almost none of them received any punishment. Over the next few years, from 1910 to 1914, there had been 327 lynching victims. And in 1915, there were over 100 in just that year. The film Birth of a Nation was released in 1915, and Du Bois thought it fueled this lynching trend. As he explains in Dusk of Dawn, before the war, Du Bois witnessed Americans going through a national psychosis of fear. The German spies would influence African Americans to be disloyal to America, preying upon their grievances. Due to this fear, there was a witch hunt against anyone who dared to think differently. He also noticed the irony of America going out to fight a terrible foe while it itself had many problems domestically. He said, "A nation with a great disease sets out to rescue civilization. It took the disease with it in its virulent form, and that disease of race hatred and prejudice hampered its actions." There have been some recent books looking at the international connections between African Americans and Indians and how the movement for India's independence movement in general, or Gandhi's thought or example, had inspired African Americans. There is Nico Slate's 2012 book, Colored Cosmopolitanism, as well as Sarah Azaransky's This Worldwide Struggle, Religion and the International Roots of the Civil Rights Movement. Azaransky argues that earlier works on these topics did not pay enough attention to these historical activists as theologians, pioneers in intercultural approaches to religion, and social ethicists. Her book focuses on their thoughts. She discovers those thoughts in their newspaper articles, their speeches, and their correspondence, as well as their better-known publications. Greg Moses' monograph, Revolution of Conscience, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Philosophy of Nonviolence, argued that King should be seen as a philosopher, and his serious contributions to our field should be better known and further studied. Azaransky is here doing similar work, but focusing on other key civil rights leaders who likewise should be studied and appreciated in our disciplines, such as Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays, and William Stewart Nelson. Each of these leaders knew each other, followed each other to India, met with Gandhi, and were enriched by their international experience. None of them carbon copied Gandhi. They gained some insights, not just from Gandhi, but from their overall international experience. These insights enrich their perspective, which shows when they wrote down their theological and philosophical discernments. The book also covers women like Polly Murray, an Episcopal minister, and Juliet Derricott, YWCA leader and Dean of Women at Fisk University. She also sketches out the content of handwritten notes on Thurman, Mays, and Nelson's meetings with the Mahatma to ascertain what was asked and what answers were given by Gandhi. It is Slate, however, who gives front and center attention to Gandhi's development of parallels between racism and caste discrimination. But over time, Slate notes that in May of 1926, Gandhi wrote to Amy Jacques Garvey, thanking her for sending him the book, The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, or Africa for the Africans. In Young India, a few months later, Gandhi said, "Our treatment of the so-called untouchables is no better than that of colored people by the white man." But when pressed to clarify his criticism further, he stated
Jill, just two more minutes. I just wanted to get that warning.
his only goal was to abolish the fifth Varna by having them join with the fourth, a goal that falls short of abolishing caste altogether. The African American press criticized Gandhi's views on caste in the 1920s, but due in large part to Gandhi's interactions with African Americans, he changed his view on caste. By the 1940s, he was advocating interdining and intermarriage, as some African Americans had suggested to him. So I really want to say that these African American thinkers really did change Gandhi's views with their firsthand accounts of their suffering, and that Gandhi was open to listening to them. These issues are so important today. At John Lewis's memorial service, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, quoting Howard Thurman, made the point that African Americans embraced and transformed a religion preached to them by slaveholders, reinterpreting its message to focus on freedom, justice, and dignity to all. And this was one of the things that this generation of African Americans going to Gandhi, seeing what he did to the message of Hinduism, they also looked at their own Christianity and changed it into this message that was being mentioned here. If we take a look at co-founders of Black Lives Matter movement who promote liberation theology, IFA transatlantic spiritual connections with ancestors, and solidarity with Black queers, transgendered, and disabled persons, as well as the undocumented, although their political opponents repeatedly characterize their movement as filled with hate, the young activists themselves frequently express their motivation as love and express that their goal is creating a beloved community. Movements like the Poor People's Campaign, led by two Christian ministers, nevertheless weave together topics both spiritual and secular, international and interspecies intersectional. And so I see a connection between this theme that's noted by Slate and Azaransky and others and the contemporary movements where we learn from each other. We learn from a multiplicity of religious encounters, as well as a global or worldwide struggle for justice. So
Okay.
the same insights and interpretations chronicled by these books are creatively unfolding in spiritually inspired movements today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. You certainly covered a lot of ground in that talk, and it's much appreciated that you emphasize that the influences didn't just go in one direction. I think we can have a little bit of time maybe for questions concerning your presentation before we get to Greg. If you see Dr. Nagel has a question there in the chat that I can read. Gail, she writes, would you consider Africans who topple Gandhi's statues, including at Legion Ghana, are misguided for considering Gandhi's politics as anti-Black racist? And Dr. Nagel also wrote, as you know, there are some scholars who hold that Gandhi never changed his view even in the 1930s. So this is definitely a hot topic among people regarding Gandhi right now. Gil, go ahead. I
Thank you
can,
so much, Mecca, for that question. And I've, yes, I know all about it. And in fact, at Greg's University a couple years ago, I gave a talk about this. Those who got their information, it's a mix, partly right and partly wrong, because we can't say of Gandhi, oh, there was not a racist bone in his body. Gandhi himself, you know, he did make comments. Now, early on in his life and over the decades. But I do think that, in fairness to Gandhi, you can see a development. And a lot of this development, as I tried to chronicle here, is because he listened to African Americans and he rethought his ideas on race. So, what I think has happened in the past is they take some of Gandhi's quotes out of context. Sometimes when he uses words that we think, oh, these are not the good words to use to refer to Black South Africans, in the same context, you can see that his point is we should model ourselves after these people. And so, yes, he used a word that is maybe not good, but how many people would use a racist word and then say, but we should take them as our role models? So I think that even some of the early quotes are considered out of context. But nevertheless, I can't say every single quote is exonerated. Many of the quotes do have this defensive idea of the Indian community is better than other communities. And in this middling period, as I mentioned before, his ideas of Varna were kind of half measures. Let's get rid of untouchability, but let's not get rid of caste altogether. He does change that. He's challenged in the 30s. He's changed by the 40s. Um, and it's true that some people have put Gandhi on a pedestal like he was a saint and he did no wrong, and you have to take him off the pedestal. But I think that there's been maybe an overcorrection that wants to throw out Gandhi as if he was a hindrance, or if he's someone we don't want to associate with that guy because of what he said, you know, years ago. And I think that would be overlooking the ways in which our worldwide movement is an interrelated movement, interrelational, as we heard from Will Barnes about Judith Butler's ideas. We are all interrelated. How are we going to throw out Gandhi and say, now you are anathema, when he contributed to civil rights movement and they contributed to him? We do have to have an open-eyed view. And the same book that I have two feelings about, Gandhi's Stretcher Bearer of Empire, does great things and does things I don't like either. They're the ones who keep harping on, you see, he hasn't changed. You see, here's another quote. He's still saying things wrong about race. Of course, they only go up to 1914. They go up to 1918, and they leave you on a cliffhanger just before Gandhi comes out with some of his best statements about how he's changed his ideas on race and caste. But they leave you at a kind of dark moment during World War I where they can say Gandhi is a hypocrite, etc. So I don't like that aspect of their book. But so much of their book is good because, as I said, it gives us the idea of thousands of people helping Gandhi's movement, all their contributions. So for that reason, it's worth a read.
okay. Thank you, Gil. Your question also addresses one that Barry raised. Because of time considerations, I think we'll move into Greg's presentation, and then perhaps at the very end, if there's more discussion for Gil, or if anyone would like to chat with her directly, they're certainly welcome to. We can get to more discussion for Gil perhaps toward the end. But now I'm pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Greg Moses, who's senior lecturer at Texas State University. As many of you know, Greg is currently the editor of the Acorn, which was formerly the Acorn, the Journal of the Gandhi King Society. Now it's Acorn Philosophical Studies and Pacifism. In fact, all three of us, Gail, Anthony, and myself, we all serve on the Acorn board. And as Gail alluded to, Greg is a scholar of Martin Luther King, and he's done great work on Gandhi as well. So let me turn things over now to Greg. The floor is yours for about the next 20 minutes, Greg.
Thank you very much. Let's begin with this exhibit. Can you all see the tweet? This is modern day scholarship. Is my screen share working? So this is a 2016 tweet from Moreland Spingarn, and look at this picture. This is such a great picture. This is Elaine Locke standing in the middle and above. To the left is William Stewart Nelson, who we'll be talking about today. And to my right is Ralph Johnson Bunch, who will go on to be a Nobel Prize winner, the first Black man to win the Nobel Prize, that first African American. At the time this picture was taken, around 1931, Elaine Locke was in his 40s, William Stewart Nelson was in his 30s, and Ralph Johnson Bunch was in his 20s. This is just an amazing collection of 20th century peacemakers. The collective impact of Elaine Locke, William Stewart Nelson, and Ralph Johnson Bunch on peace history of the 20th century is really, I think, a great unappreciated treasure. We want to talk a little bit today about William Stewart Nelson, who was the excuse me, who was the dean of the Howard School of Religion and the founder of the Journal of Religious Thought in the 1940s. So since today we're talking about peace and hope in dark times, we can think about the years 1943 to 1948. Those are dark times. That's a world war, and that's a time of partition riots. But it's also a time when William Stewart Nelson and the Howard School of Religion and the Journal of Religious Thought were developing some of the main lines of peace theory that will later be taken up and popularized by Martin Luther King. So on the one hand, when we're talking about William Stewart Nelson, we're talking about Lockean roots of pluralism. And on the other hand, we're talking about Kingian fruits, how to take these pluralistic theories and transform them into to street battles. In 1946 and 47, William Stewart Nelson traveled to India. And before he took the trip to India, he knew that where he was going, Kolkata, formerly known as Calcutta, had suffered a great partition riot with lots of people killed in the streets. And rather than William Stewart Nelson deferring his trip to India, he brought his wife, and his wife came with him. And they spent a year in India from 1946 to 47 in Kolkata, Calcutta, during this very turbulent time, and worked with Quakers and Gandhi on peace issues at that time. Gandhi in those years was suffering something that we talked about a little bit the last panel, which is that at some point you can see that the Kingian nonviolence movement had not internalized the Kingian nonviolence. And the same thing Gandhi was suffering with in the last years of his life is that even though the nonviolence movement had been taken up for practical aims by the independence movement, it had not been internalized by the population. And I think this was quite heartbreaking for Gandhi. Now, what were some of the activities that that William Stewart Nelson was engaged in at the time? He was working with the Quakers, and they would bring circles of conversants together from the Muslim community and the Hindu community. And then also Gandhi would be walking into villages in what is today known as Bangladesh, Muslim-controlled villages, and he would walk in and try to renegotiate or negotiate the return of Hindus who had been driven out. I want you to imagine, right? You're walking in to a Muslim village beside Gandhi right after a riot where the Hindus have been violently thrown out, and you're walking back in. So right after these experiences, William Stewart Nelson gives some lectures at Kolkata. The lectures are codified in a book that you can find at archive.org called Bases of World Understanding. The subtitle is An Inquiry into the Means of Resolving Racial, Religious, Class, and National Misapprehensions and Conflicts. When we're thinking about what William Stewart Nelson is doing, we have to think of him in community with Howard Thurman, who we're going to hear from next, with James Farmer Sr., who is very important to my own theorizing, with Benjamin Mays, who preceded William Stewart Nelson as Dean of the School of Religion. This is an amazing collection of religious social ethicists, as Gale says, Ozeransky is trying to help us understand. And the point is to try to practice a religion that is anti-dogmatic. So in the Kolkata lectures, we see that one of the ways that Nelson is practicing an anti-dogmatic religion is by putting it into conversation with philosophy and science. So you can't have religion without philosophy, you can't have religion without science, and you have a circle of these interdependent disciplines. But also you have an anti-dogmatic religion because it demands mutual respect with all other religions, with all other cultures. And so you're resisting the any effort to become a Christian supremacist. And certainly you would think that these African American thinkers had a face full of Christian supremacy. They knew what that looked like. They didn't want to repeat it. And I think that this is exemplified in King calling Gandhi the greatest Christian of the 20th century, right? You can't be a Christian supremacist and do that. But this brings us to the hard problem for the anti-dogmatist, which is confronting dogmatism. And there has to be some sense in which the anti-dogmatist is unyielding at some point to dogmatism, right? So you think of anti-dogmatism as being totally, flexible, but no, it has to be unyielding in the face of dogmatism in some way, right? So as a guideline to how this works is we have to understand the religious humanism of this school of the Rankin School, the Rankin Chapel at Howard University. And that religious humanism requires that we see dignity in everyone. And this becomes very difficult when you're facing anti-dogmatists. I get up in the morning on Saturday, so I've already watched my Velshi in the morning. And goodness gracious, we could mention some names today of dogmatists. And what this teaching would say is that here's the thing, nevertheless, you have to see the dignity in the person. Right. And we have to have an ability to approach. We have to have an ability, as the Quakers were working with circles of dialogue, and as Gandhi was walking into villages, we have to maintain the ability to approach. I had another good point, but then I have my handwriting. So maybe in questions, I'll discover what that point was. So let's talk about Trumpist terrorism, shall we? So we bring it on home. It's terrorism. Now, what does terrorism do? Terrorism hardens the heart. Terrorism reduces rationality. Terrorism disempowers anti-dogmatism. So the challenge, the hard problem in front of us is to fight dogmatism without becoming counter-dogmatic. This is the hard problem. It becomes an even more difficult problem under King's leadership because we have to organize collective power. So this is an especially difficult thing. How do you organize collective power, such as the massive resources that we see in Black Lives Matter, and yet maintain the ability to not become dogmatic or counter-dogmatic? It's a very difficult problem. And we're remembering all these different things today because this is, as Sanjay pointed out to us in the morning session, this is the anniversary of Gandhi's assassination. And thank you for pointing that out, Sanjay. I actually wouldn't have known that. But wasn't Gandhi assassinated by a dogmatist? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Greg. You left much time for discussion on your presentation. And in fact, what you touched upon is, as many of you may know, a controversial topic in India, because Gandhi's assassin is in many circles now hailed as a bit of a hero. There's some discussion as to whether the current political leadership in India is tied to those who revere his assassin. But today is in fact the day of Gandhi's assassination, so it kind of works out well for our conference to have this panel today. Let me see. I don't see right now any questions for Greg. If you want, we can hold off and move into Anthony's presentation, and then we can have further discussion on what all of the panelists have said. Okay, so Dr. Anthony Neal, as I said, he's also a member of the Acorn editorial board. He's professor of philosophy at Mississippi State University, and Dr. Neal is also affiliated with the African American Studies Department. He's written books, including on Thurman and mysticism. Today, his talk for us is on Gandhi, Thurman, and the issue of aim. So go ahead, Anthony. The floor is yours now.
Okay, and just want to say I'm glad to be here. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Presby once before. I don't know, doubt she remembers me. But so when I got ready to, I guess I hadn't noticed the program. So when I saw her name, I was a bit shaken, because I know she's a tremendous scholar in her own right. So I said, well, I've got to get my stuff right. So actually, I pulled back on certain things that I was going to say, just in case you went into great detail with your stuff. So in any case, and glad to see you again, Greg and Sanjay. One of the things I want to say is that, so I speak from the point of view of the freedom struggle as opposed to the civil rights movement. In fact, I'm working on a book now where it's the title and the subject matter is the modern era of the African American freedom struggle, which I date from 1896 to 1975. So I would assume, I make the assumption that Black people or African Americans were engaged in freedom struggle from the moment they hit the American shores. and that there are different movements within the freedom struggle. And certainly by the time you get to Plessy versus Ferguson, you get a new type of struggle with Du Bois and people actually becoming formally educated. So the movement takes on a different type of struggle, and there are different causes. Different goals. So with an overall goal of freedom. Again, my paper is entitled Gandhi, Thurman, and the Question of Aim. And I'll begin with an epigraph. There is something in every one of you that awaits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. It is the only true guide you will ever have. And if you cannot hear it, you will all of your life spend your days on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. The above epigraph was one of the guiding principles through which Howard Thurman verbally projected his intent to develop unique ideas towards the end of his life. Speaking to a group of graduating seniors at Spelman College, Thurman used this statement as a dictum upon which he and others who wish to become their genuine or authentic selves could find their way through a world dimly lit. In this presentation, I will offer something of the philosophical ideas of Howard Thurman with an aim of providing a glimpse of what is lost if we concern ourselves only with finding a Gandhian influence. It is not my intent to play every key in Thurman's unique melody, noting where there is harmony or discord with other thinkers, such that the complete score rings fully formed from my words. I only hope to correctly play 2, possibly 3 bars, so that it may be clear upon your next hearing what the distinct Thurman melody was, and a beautiful melody it was. It is also not my intent to discount the influence of Gandhi upon the Black activists in the so-called civil rights movement. I simply want to throw light upon the Black people themselves and their struggle for freedom. Or as Adolph Reed said, to look within the jug, allowing the world to benefit from whatever unique ideas and mannerisms which may be universalizable. For I fear that during the crucible of chattel slavery and Jim Crow, certain ideas, strategies, and defenses were developed by the Black people themselves, which may be lost to the world if scholars continue to search through their words, looking only for the ideas of others. To accomplish the goal of this presentation by way of method, I want to turn to a little known book written by Alfred North Whitehead entitled The Function of Reason. In this book, Whitehead states as his primary consideration the essence of reason, or the metaphysical nature of reason. Whitehead puts forward that the function of reason is to promote the art of life. Here, I am not interested in fully explicating what Whitehead means by the art of life and its connection to reason. I only want to put this forward in order that I may discuss in a limited way how Whitehead formed this conclusion. Whitehead's conclusion is dependent on the acceptance of an existence of final causation. According to Whitehead, without the acceptance of final causation, it becomes impossible to determine the aim, or more specifically, the aim of reason. For Whitehead, in his determination that the function of reason is to promote the art of living, focused on the upward trend of evolution. In doing so, he noticed the aim of life as being tripartite in focus. These 3 foci are to live well, and to live better. Final causation, which admittedly Whitehead takes from the metaphysics of Aristotle, accordingly is the only way we can form the conclusions about actions made, paths taken, ideas formed, and particularly those in the due course of reason. In order to learn something of Thurman's aim, we should probably consult and pay close attention to the questions that he himself said drove his works. We are justified in performing this type of investigation because we know that at the behest of George Cross, who Thurman considered his most influential professor while at Rochester Seminary, Thurman was told to focus on the timeless issues of the human spirit. And in order to perform this task, certain questions would have to be put forward for the purpose of deciphering these timeless issues. So if we look at his writings carefully, one question that comes to the fore is, what is the value of religion, particularly the Christian religion, to the disinherited? This question arises out of the interrogation Thurman receives while in India from a young Indian attorney. The question that was initially put to Thurman was, how could he, as a Black man in America, suffering at the hands of those who claim to be Christian, come to India representing Christianity? So this question takes Thurman somewhere about 15 years to answer. The answer becomes several articles, but also becomes the book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And I want to say that the conversation for Thurman with this young Indian interrogator was actually had more of a profound influence actually for that moment than his conversation with Gandhi. And I know I don't want to push back on several elder professors and philosophers that I know of that would disagree in some way, but he only spoke to Gandhi for a few hours. And most people don't realize that. Gandhi actually pulls out a watch and says, I must talk according to the clock. And in fact, we don't see mention of Gandhi in Thurman's writings anymore until you get to Thurman's own autobiography. But in Jesus and the Disinherited, Thurman brings to the fore what is the value of Christianity. And in fact, Thurman says that in some ways, he turns from what he understands as Christendom or Christianity towards the religion of love, which he takes to be the fundamental religion of Jesus. Another question with which Thurman wrestled with was, what tools are available to help the individual and the community to maintain an openness to the encounter of love or the experience of love in the midst of our becoming through whatever struggles life brings? He believed the experience of becoming was just as important as what we become. In 1958, Martin Luther King Jr. was lying in a hospital bed in Harlem, New York, after being stabbed by what was termed a deranged woman who had, and it was during this time of crisis that Howard Thurman took it upon himself to visit his young mentee and Morehouse brother because he believed that the movement had become a living organism with the ability to swallow Dr. King whole. Upon seeing Dr. King in the bed, Thurman asked Martin how long was he scheduled to remain in the hospital. And King said about 3 days. And Thurman impressed upon him the necessity to remain an additional 2 weeks in the hospital. All indications suggest that the additional time was taken and that there was even more time taken later the next year to travel to the home of Gandhi in India. While no exact transcript of the two gentlemen's conversation was ever recorded, but according to Thurman, he told King that if he didn't take some time off from his torturous schedule and become spiritually strong, the movement would consume him. He went further by sharing a quote from his book entitled The Mood at Christmas Time. There must, and this is the quote, there must always be remaining in every man's life some place for the singing of angels, some place for that which is breathlessly beautiful and by an inherent prerogative, throwing all the rest of life into a new and creative relatedness, something that gathers up in itself all the freshets of experience from drab and commonplace areas of life and glows in one bright light of penetrating beauty and meaning and then passes. The commonplace is shot through. Excuse me, my computer blanked for a second. Okay, the commonplace is shot through with the new glory. Old burdens become lighter. Deep and ancient wounds lose much of their old hurting. A crown is placed over our heads that the rest of our lives we are trying to grow tall enough to wear. Despite all the crashness of life, despite all the hardness of life, despite all the harsh discourse of life, life is saved by the singing of angels. Of all his meditations, why does Thurman choose this meditation? What is the significance beyond the obvious that experiences of beauty, experiences of the ecstatic, experiences of the sublime change us? It is my belief that Thurman is saying something to Martin about the masculine and feminine nature of life. Thurman is explicating that our fundamental nature has certain rhythms to which we must respond, like living and dying, which is why he wrote the Negro song speaks of the Negro spiritual, speaks of or sings of life and death. There must always be a coming and going, a rise and a fall, a building up of energy, a dispersing of energy, and then also a restoration. Our active nature requires that we have moments in which we are sometimes passive, and it seems that Dr. King took the message very seriously. And it's ironic, just 1 month before Dr. King was asked to lecture before the United Churches of Christ held at Purdue University, the subject of which would become a book entitled The Measure of Man. His chosen subject in the 2 lectures was the measure of man and the 3 dimensions of a complete life. In these speeches, King wrestles with the existential questions of life and attempts to provide a metaphysical grounding from which questions could be launched, such as the Deleuzian notion of how might a person live, or what is worth the risk of death. Thurman's own written discourse on the matter is published in 1963 in a work entitled The Disciplines of the Spirit. And it is in this work that he places before each individual the questions that should be answered before they can actualize their fullest potential. These questions are, and he takes 2 of them from Augustine: who am I? What do I want? And what will I do? The summative version of these questions is put before the Spelman College graduating class of 1980, which I read at the beginning of this discussion. The last question of which I draw attention to is, what is the common ground that floats the private adventure of the individual or solitary life? Or stated differently, what is the harmonious component of life, and what is common? What is the common of all life? Thurman puts forward the quote that his goal in life was to be himself without making it difficult for others to be themselves. And Thurman answers these questions in which I take to be at least my favorite of his books, if not the best of his books, The Search for Common Ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. I see we do have some questions, and we actually now have plenty of time for good discussion. There's a question from Bill Gay for Greg, which you might be able to see in the Q&A box, but I'll read it. Bill writes, Greg, you note the need to counter the dogmatism of the right without a lapse ourselves into dogmatic counter-dogmatism. So Bill asks, beyond avoiding physical violence, what would you suggest in relation to the type of discourse that we ourselves employ?
Thank you, Bill, for that question. Anything that I know, I hope that it's owing to a correct reading of King So let me give you what I think is the Kingian answer. And the Kingian answer is what I think we should aspire to, even though we seldom feel like it. So the Kingian answer is that you must distinguish the structure of evil from the glory of the personality. And when you're faced with someone such as you might have seen on the evening news last night or the morning news this morning, you have to engage in an analysis here. What are you seeing? And if you say that you are seeing a demon, then you're not doing the Kingian analysis. What you're seeing is the glorious possibility of personality twisted by an abhorrent structure of white supremacy. And somehow you have to focus your agenda on where you're going. If you're not going in the direction of white supremacy, where are you going? And how is it that the path that you are on is compatible with that path? You have to say somehow that, my existence is not incompatible with your existence. I look forward to the day when we can work together. But let me tell you, the path you're on is incompatible with the path I'm on. I cannot walk your path, and let me tell you why. This is the path I'm walking, and this is where I cannot go where you're going. Why don't you come along? So I think that's where the answer starts.
Right. Thank you, Greg. There's a question from Will Barnes. I know there's also one from Rashad that I think Will had asked first. I'm making sure I can get all of it here on my screen. It's again directed to Greg. Will notes that the hard problem is one of the most vital challenges at the heart of my own life and thought. And also, Will writes that I think naming non-supremacism, if that's the right way to say it, as if not the guiding aspiration for the projects of nonviolence and peace is brilliant and timely. I don't have a contribution or question per se, but I'm working the notion of critical idealism committed to the view that no ideal is beyond reproach. So critical idealism robustly opposes dogmatism in the name of peace, human flourishing, nonviolence, and justice, while holding the commitment to anti-dogmatism as a self-policing ideal that even when opposing dogmatism, we can remain open to fallibility. And I'm sorry, my screen here is not okay. Maybe if Will, if you want to finish your comment and or question yourself, you can get unmuted and do that.
I think I get the drift.
Okay.
And it's complex. So there's no short question, there's no short answer. But there's the beginning of a question and the beginning of an answer. And the beginning of my answer has to do with what Anthony was talking about in terms of Howard Thurman's approach to beauty and in terms of King's approach to the third dimension of a complete life. I think this is what Anthony's pointing to when he points to final causes. So Will uses the term in the start of his question of beyond non-supremacism. He uses the term non-supremacism. So what I want to say is we have to get beyond non-supremacism. Non-supremacism is a consequence of of the path we're on. But we can't define the path we're on in terms of non-supremacism. we can define the path we're on in terms of beauty and all of the wonderful things that Howard Thurman says about beauty in Common Ground. And the path we're on has to do with this third dimension of the complete life. What King called the religious dimension. This is what William Stuart Nelson refers to as the religious humanist commitment to the glorious possibilities of the human being. That, as Anthony says, Thurman said to King, you have to take 2 weeks and talk to the angels, right? I mean, if you spend all your time arguing with Trumpists, you're never going to see an angel, right? So you better go get in touch with the angels so you remember where you're going, because this Trumpist terrorism is really what it is. It's a tactic to remove angels from the field.
Okay, and there's a question for Gil from Rashad. Uh, Rashad writes, I'm worried as a graduate student about our current cancel culture and how this relates to Gandhi. Your claim seems to be that cancel culture's fallacy is that it overlooks the good that a person does and says that they should be canceled in virtue of the bad that they did. Okay, so Rashad says, my question is, are you worried about the tendency of being selective about what we praise in historical persons? E.g., we are willing to forgive some things, but unforgiving of others. Okay, go ahead, Gil.
Thanks a lot for that. And of course, it's always hard to pass judgment on other people, but it's hard to not do it because we want to pick out the part about someone that we want to model, which is part of what Gandhi was always doing, right? Let's look at what these folks are doing. We want to model this good thing they're doing. So he's making a lot of judgments. He did that with the suffragettes. There's some things they do we don't want to copy, but their courage, we want to copy that. And so we could do the same with Gandhi and say, there's all these things about Gandhi that we want to copy, but we don't want to copy certain parts. And I mean, in a way, how can we not do that? It's true. In that case, we're talking about what's meaningful for us and our goals. And we're also talking from our time period in history, because it is important, I think, when we're talking about historical personages, to recognize them in their context. And I realize historians have done that with Gandhi, and they've said, in Gandhi's context, he was not the most radical. He was not the most egalitarian. He had all these flaws in his historical context. I know that some commentators were saying that. But if you look at other scholars like, Vinay Lal from UCLA, he's gone on and he goes, look at the influence of Gandhi, the influence of his campaign for nonviolence. It's just clear that he's, overall, he's helping the good of people. He's a model for nonviolence, a flawed model, a model that's helpful, and but we have to do it with open eyes to his shortcomings. And even historians like Rajmohan Gandhi have said the same thing, even though Rajmohan is a grandson of Gandhi. He says, we can't run away from Gandhi's racist comments. But this is not to condone them, but so, I mean, what you're referring to is something, we'll always have that tension. Right? So many of the leaders of the women's movements over the decades and centuries have not necessarily had a good position on race. And it's important to know that while still taking to heart that they have contributed to history in the ways they work for equality within those limits. I don't know how else to answer that. Maybe some of the other panelists want to chime in on this.
I'd like to say just a bit on that. So one of the things as a Black male doing philosophy, it'd be difficult to do philosophy if I say, well, I'm going to remove all of the text and all of the writers who were racist, right? So that's going to do away with a whole lot of philosophy, right? It's going to be, so I'm going to be left with a narrow scope. But one of the things that I like to consider is that if we, and this is one of the arguments I've made about Thurman, and my friend Ilya Davis has made the same comments about King, that if we raise them to the point of saints and we don't critique them, I mean, King was wrong on Ella Baker. I mean, there's just no way around it. You know, he's asking Ella Baker, is she going to be cooking cookies, right? Baking cookies and all of this kind of stuff. So he was definitely treating her in a sexist way. So we don't want to kind of skirt around it. But one of the things that we do justly when we humanize them is that, and we critique them, we now add them to a discursive tradition such that we can say, okay, their ideas are relevant to reading. If we read them as if they're perfect, right? Which is sometimes Thurman comes off. There's a way in which people have read Thurman as if he were perfect. Well, then there's no need to even bring him into our cadre of scholars because we can't ascend to his heights, right? So I think the beauty of them is to know that they had some flaws, and now we can wrestle with their ideas in the same way in which we would wrestle with Kant and Hegel and any of these other people, right? If they're saints, there's no need to do that because they were perfect. So that's my comment.
Okay, thank you. We have time real quick for one more question. Rashad has a different question for Greg. Rashad writes, you had raised problems with dogmatism. However, I want to push back against this a little bit. MLK's famous line is that there is nothing objectively wrong with fundamentalism, dogmatism. It is, quote, rather a question of what kind of fundamentalist dogmatism we are that matters. What are your thoughts on this, Greg?
Well, there's King being a philosopher, right? What do you mean by fundamentalism? What do you mean by dogmatism? And that's like King's letter from Birmingham jail, right? First, I don't want to be called an extremist, but now that you bring it up, right? Why don't you call me an extremist for love, right? So yeah, why don't you call me a dogmatist for nonviolence, right? Why don't you call me a fundamentalist for love? Why don't you say I'm a fundamentalist when Jesus says love your enemies, and I say read that text, right? Do what he said. That's what I think. What do you think, Anthony?
No, I certainly agree with you. So yeah, and in that same sense, Thurman is doing the same thing with the idea of love because he knows that that's an expansive claim. So you can be dogmatic on the sense of, hey, I'm open to the experience of love.
Okay, thank you. And I see Barry has some comments that are not, I don't think, meant to be questions. That there's a nice quote regarding Mao that Barry gives us, which everyone can see there in the chat room. Uh, we have officially 2 minutes left. Does anyone have any last minute questions or comments?
Well, I just want to say one other thing. I want to be clear. So, I don't want to dismiss the notion that Gandhi and others were influential on the African American freedom struggle. What I want to say more about is that, there's this huge tradition of struggle that oftentimes gets displaced when we go to graduate schools in terms of canon. Right. So there are all these other thinkers that we should be reading, and we reduce them down to maybe Thurman studied with Rufus Jones, so there's no need to really read Thurman's canon. I can just read Rufus Jones, or in the same way with King and Gandhi and all of these kinds of things. And I think that we miss the richness of that kind of tradition, and we lose the jazz, the sort of jazz of the moment, right? And that's my biggest claim.
Okay, thank you. And I just realized that attendees can't read the comments, so I will just point out what Barry shared with us. It's a quote, as I said, regarding regarding Mao from Ping, and the translation of the quote is that on a scale of 10, Mao was 3/10 wrong, 7/10 right. So that's certainly fitting for our discussion here. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for the presentations. All of our panelists did a great job. I look forward to engaging in more conversations with each of you on this. Barry also, by the way, noted that the presentations have given him a reading list for the next year. Okay, so on that note, I think we can end. And
Yeah, anyone can send me an email and I'll send you reading list and links to click on.
And pictures.
okay. And there is a real, it seems like a quick question from Will to all the panelists. He asks, is everyone welcome at the executive committee meeting? Does anyone know the answer to that?
Probably not.
Okay.
There is a general meeting. There's a, I mean, my guess based on CPP practice is that the executive meeting is a kind of a board meeting, and then there's a general business meeting, which I believe is on the schedule for this room later this afternoon.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
But my question is, how are people going to chat in Zoom room 1?
I'll just put them in
that's
the,
the plenary.
right. So I've asked the organizers of the business meeting to tell me how they want to do it, because I can put everybody in panelist mode.
Okay. All right. So I think now is the lunch break. So we should see each other later. I hope everyone has a good lunch. It really is kind of unfortunate that we can't, and as an in-person conference,